Shalom lekulam. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the weekly English virtual lecture discussion of the Begin Center. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the center, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you from various parts of the world. We always have an international audience, people here in Israel, the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. I think some of you are regulars and some of you are maybe new. Every week I moderate a discussion or we hear a lecture from a journalist or academic or writer or a public figure, usually around Israeli politics or policy or the Middle East or the wider Jewish world. And occasionally we also talk about historical issues. But always things that are relevant to the work that we do here at the Begin Center, connected to the legacy of Menachem Begin. And today we're actually starting a series of four discussions which are going to be focused very much on Menachem Begin and his legacy. And we're doing that mainly because this year we will be marking the 30th anniversary of Begin's yahrzeit of his passing in 1992. The yahrzeit actually falls in March of this year. And so we wanted to sort of start the secular year with this series of conversations. And we're starting not at the beginning of Begin's career as a major figure in Israeli Jewish history, which would obviously be sort of as back in the 1940s and his leadership of the Etzel, the Irgun, but the start of his tenure as prime minister. And I'm delighted to have with me the author of a seminal new book, really the first of its kind, the first really well-researched deep dive into Begin's election victory in 1977 and his first term in office, which saw him and his government change the country in so many fundamental ways. And his election victory, many of you will know, was known as the Mahapach. It's a kind of untranslatable word in English. It's been translated most recently in the excellent documentary about Begin in English as upheaval, but it's from I think, and our speaker will correct me in a few minutes if I'm wrong, but I think that it was actually a completely invented new word when the news anchor used it. But it's from the root of lafuch, of something being turned upside down. And it really was the turning upside down of Israeli politics after 30 years of the labor movement being in power, and in fact much longer than 30 years of the labor movement being the dominant force in Zionist politics. As I said, I'm delighted to have with me the author of that book, Dr. Moshe Fuchsman-Shal. He's one of Israel's leading experts on Begin and specifically Begin's socioeconomic agenda. He's also the former deputy director of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, in which role he had the pleasure of being my boss. He's also a lecturer in the Politics and Communications Department at the School of Government and Social Sciences at Hadassah Academic College. He holds a doctorate in political history from Tel Aviv University. And as I said, his new book, which just came out in Hebrew, is Gevrotai v'Rabotai Mahapach, Ladies and Gentlemen Mahapach. As I said, it's a deeply researched analysis of the reforms that Begin made in that first term in office. Moshe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Paul. And it was really a privilege working with you in the Begin Center for I think 4 or 5 years ago. And hello, everybody. So like Paul said, this is the book that I wrote. It's called Mahapach. It's now on all the bookstores around Israel and deals with 4 years, 1977 and 1981. And one of the recommendations about the book done by Micha Goodman, who is one of Israel's great speaker and author and professor, and he wrote that this book actually tells the story about 4 years, which created the new Israeli politics. And I think that he was quite correct. And when Paul said about the Mahapach, about this word, upheaval, and this word was born in 17th of May, 1977. It was at around 10 o'clock at night. That Chaim Yavin, the main anchorman of the Israeli television, had to deliver first time. There was a poll on television and there was a prediction who will win the election. And when he got the result of the poll, and he couldn't believe it. And actually nobody could believe it. And they really thought about not broadcasting the result on television, because they said, if it's wrong, all of us will not have any job tomorrow. So we will all be fired. And actually Chaim Yavin was born in Germany, and during the Weimar Republic, before the Nazis came to power, before Hitler. And he wanted to say, ladies and gentlemen, Mahapecha, which means revolution. But he said that the one who was born in Germany, and he knew how they treated Begin in those years, especially by labor, he said, if I will say revolution, who knows what will happen? Some commanders in the army can suddenly decided to move the tanks to Jerusalem or something. No, I don't want to give anybody ideas. So this is in the end, and also we thought, he had like few minutes before we started broadcasting, and everybody waited, and he said, in the last minute, he said Mahapach, which means like upheaval, like turning upside down, as Paul said. But I think this is an example of how important this was, that for the first time, after almost 30 years, for the first time, the right-wing party will lead the government. And if you are thinking about it, actually we have, I would say, political hegemony from the 30s. From the 30s, Ben-Gurion won the election in the Zionist Congress, and from 1933 onward, so it's almost 40, I would say 43 years of domination, of vote after vote, election after election, that the people of Israel know that tomorrow they will wake up after the election and the same party will lead the government. And the shock was that for the first time, Begin will come to power. And you know, if you're looking at the newspapers the day before, so you can see some of the ads. For instance, Shulamit Aloni was leading a party named Ratz, which is a left party, and she just put a big picture of Masada, and this was their main ad in the newspaper a day before, a big picture of Masada, and saying, and the headline was, let's not get there. Like, if Begin will be in power, this is our end, Masada, a collective suicide, and the end of the Jewish sovereign state. So this was actually a lot of the reaction, also in Israel, and also in the world. Jimmy Carter in the White House, some Israeli journalists in Washington got leads that they are thinking about stop selling arms to Israel. And in Britain, they say Begin and Fagin, which is a figure Paul probably know better from Dickens, right? Fagin.
Yeah, that was, I think, was it, I forget which, was it The Economist? I forget which journal it was that said that. Or it was, but it was interesting. That was very, I mean, that was seen as a real sign of the way Begin was seen, because because I think the thing was no one knew how to pronounce his name, because written in English, it looks like the word begin. So, and people didn't know him outside of Israel. So they needed, so in order to say, how do you pronounce his name? They thought, okay, what can we rhyme it with? And what they chose was Fagin, which of course is this, the villainous, Jewish villainous character in Charles Dickens, sort of anti-Semitic character in many respects.
Right, so Begin, Fagin, and also a lot of newspapers in Europe said that the Geneva conference, the peace conference was supposed to be in a few months, and they said that in Geneva there will be two leaders of terrorist groups. One will be Begin, and the second will be Arafat. So this was the reaction also, and it wasn't easy for Begin. And actually, in the weekend, the Likud, the party, Begin's party, actually put an ad saying that they want to relax everybody, that they are going to preserve the democracy, and they can assure everybody that none of the apocalyptic, I would say, prediction comes through, and so on. So this was the reaction for the first time, and I think actually this was the first time that Israel is a real democracy, because changing of power, changing of parties, of sides, is actually one of the most important signs for a violent democracy, that could be also a change in parties that are in power after more than 30 years. So this is a little bit about the Mahapach, about this night of the 17th of May, 77.
Great, and firstly, Sally Esikoff corrected me. It was Time magazine that had the Begin-Fagin quote. So despite the fact that, as you say, there was not the apocalyptic scenario that was predicted, there was nevertheless, in Begin's taking over power did nevertheless signal a huge change in the way, in all kinds of aspects of Israeli life. Can you speak to some of those? Because I think that the term, obviously the term Mahapach was coined on that election night, but we can look back at that first term and say, you know what, it really was a Mahapach, because it really did turn things upside down in so many ways. Can you mention some of the most significant ways that Israel basically looked different in 1981 than it did in 1977, the day before Begin came to power?
Well, yes, I think that it was Mahapach, perhaps even it was a revolution, actually, if we can, because if you look at the aspects, I think those 4 years, Begin really managed to change the course of Israel on all the topics. So if I will go like briefly on each one of them. So if we're talking about, for instance, Jewish identity, until 77, I would say that Israel was a much more secular state, leading by a very secular party. And Menachem Begin, I really feel, changed the Jewish identity of the state. First of all, the first time, as prime minister, after he got from the president the opportunity to go out and to form a government. So the first thing that he did was going to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, to pray. And then he went to Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son of Rabbi Kook. And, if you look at the newspaper of those times, you can see how much criticism there is about him. Like, it was like, what, a prime minister, a secular state, going to the Western Wall to pray. And you can see the editorial articles in most of the newspaper. I think if we are going back to those years of 77, it was really a big change. And when he's been asked by a reporter outside the prime minister office by, I think it was Yaakov Achimeir, and he asked him, Menachem Begin, when he entered, say, Mr. Prime Minister, in what kind of course you're going to be a prime minister? What kind of prime minister you're going to be? So Begin looked at him and he said, I'm going to form a government and to be, how he said it? He said it in a good Jewish manner. I'm going to be a prime minister. And
Signon Yehudi Tov.
Signon Yehudi Tov, right, as he said. And you can see the respect for the rabbis, for the chief rabbis. How many, the legislative, for instance, Begin actually, I don't know how many people know that, stopped El Al from flying on Shabbat. Because El Al, the national airline of Israel, until 77, until Begin came to power, used to fly on Shabbat. And Begin said, I'm sorry, but for me, seeing our airplanes with the Star of David on their tail, flying and like lifting and landing all over the capitals of the world, is like saying to the world that the Jewish people had forgotten the Shabbat. And for instance, and he decided to close El Al on Shabbat. And you can see taking the chief rabbis and so on and making them, I would say, a national body and giving them more and more authorities and more, I would say, in legislating more and more aspects. That's the one point. But if you're saying of, for instance, his first visit to the States. So the first visit of Begin to the state was on the end of July, the 1st of August, 77. So the first thing that he's doing is landing in New York and he's meeting Moshe Feinstein, the head of Agudat Israel in the States. He's meeting Rabbi Soloveitchik and meeting the Rabbi of Chabad, and the
Lubavitcher Rebbe.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe, of course. And he's meeting them and getting their blessing to start his visit in the States. And when he's been interviewed by, there are two Good Morning America, and there was the other show there, and they're asking him, Mr. Prime Minister, you are coming here to the States, you're going to visit Carter, what you're going to say, what will be his plan for your visit. So he stopped and said, in the beginning, I want to say that we are on the eve of Tisha B'Av, and started to give them 5 minutes in prime time on American television about what is Tisha B'Av for the Jewish people and how important it is. So all of his behavior, but also in my book I showed all of the legislative that he made about the Shabbat and about other things. So we really see how Israel became much more a Jewish state. For instance, now, if a prime minister wins the election, going to the Kotel is like seeing an ordinary and even expected move. But then when Begin started it, it was looked the other way at all. And you can really say that he changed the whole Pharisee. And also there was the Rabbi Schindler that was the head of the President Conference. And after he met Begin, he said, I met a lot of prime minister, Israeli prime minister, some were pioneers, some were military person, politician, first time a Jewish prime minister.
He was just to point out, it's important because he was a reform rabbi. He was a reform rabbi who I think expected to not like Begin because he assumed that his loyalties would lie more with the left, and he was surprised to find that Begin spoke to him in a way that previous Israeli prime ministers couldn't speak to him as a diaspora Jew.
Right. And also, for the first time, he took the Orthodox parties. The Orthodox parties, like Agudat Israel in the Knesset, actually boycott from 52. Right. They boycotted the government, and they say we are not going to enter any coalition because this is a very secular coalition, and what they are doing, we're against it, and we're not wanting to take a part in managing this country. And you can see that when Begin came to power, one of the things that he's doing, he's bringing them back into the government to take responsibility, and which is also very important because they also identified that there is a prime minister who really sees their way, and I think perhaps he was even the first, I would say, religious prime minister, although he didn't observe the Shabbat or America, but he had a really deep, I would say, deep tradition and a deep faith that really affected him. So this is, for instance, only in the Jewish state, the regional state. And also, for instance, if we are taking the military and the defensive and the security of Israel. So Begin actually has, first of all, we know the Merkava tank, Israel leading tank or one of the leading tanks in the world. And when Begin came to power, this tank was still on sketches and so on. And because, it took a lot of money and a big part of our budget in order to start actually building this tank and having an Israeli owned tank, Merkava. And for the first time, it's appeared in the battle in the Lebanon war. Begin decided on developing Israeli aircraft, a military aircraft called the Lavi, which was an attack jet, which was supposed to be one of the, compared to the F-16. And also he decided and gave the order to launch the Israeli space program and actually launching our satellite, the Israeli satellite. And if you look at all those three things, you can understand his point of view of being military independent, which is also very identified with Begin. He didn't want to be, I would say, he didn't want to owe anybody anything and to ask the American for planes or for tanks and so on. And I think this was part of his legacy of security independence. I think that this was one of the lessons that he got from the Holocaust. Begin's whole family was murdered by the Germans. And I think Tom Friedman in the New York Times wrote after Begin left office that he made Israel Yad Vashem with an F-16. So actually, Begin did had, I think the the Holocaust, what happened to his family was very important to Begin and really shaped his point of view of, first of all, that we can't count on anybody else but ourselves. And those three, for instance, very important decisions that were very much criticized because, the amount of the budget that we needed. And afterwards, the Lavi project, for instance, was canceled by later governments because of the burden on the budget that it took. So this, for instance, only from the security aspects. And for instance, Judea and Samaria, when Begin came to power, there were like 25 settlements, Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria. When he left, after 7 years, we had 125 settlements, and there were 5,000 Jewish settlers, and when he left, it was 25,000, and he actually made this infrastructure of building a lot of new settlements, of taking lands there and making them state lands in order to have, like later in the future, even until today, the lands that Begin decided to make them as the lands of the state are being used to build new settlements today. So I think he had also a very important role in those years in erasing the green line, as we call it. Of course, we have also the economic and social revolution that he made.
Before you get into that, I just want to say, I did want to, it's my mistake. I forgot to say, for those of you who are new to this, please do write questions into the chat because there's going to be time for me to put your questions to Moshe. And actually, a couple of people have already asked questions specifically relating to the socioeconomic points. So I know you're going to cover these things anyway, but I'll just put them to you so you can include them. So Shmuel Yerushalmi asked about the impact of the development towns, the Ayar Pituach residents and other low socioeconomic groups in Israel, and how Begin impacted, how the Ma'apach impacted those people living in development towns. And Stephen Nadler asks very simply, and I think you're going to come to this now, was Begin instrumental in moving the Israeli economy from being more from being more centralized to being more capitalistic?
So the question was about what? About
very simply about Begin's role in making Israel more of a capitalist country.
Sure. So first of all, about the development towns and what we call the second Israel. What we call the second Israel are Jews that were born in North Africa countries, in Arab countries, and so on. And after, when they came in the 50s, their social economic, I would say, situation was very bad. Even in the 70s, they lived in development towns, in very poor neighborhoods in the main cities, as we know. And I think, you know, I have here a quote of Begin that I wanted to read to you. And Begin used to quote Marx and said that Marx used to say that life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. That means, you know, if I'm a worker, my consciousness is a social consciousness and so on. And Begin used to say that it's just the other way around, that the consciousness is actually affecting your life. And what is more important is the consciousness. So Begin, I would say, he saw himself as like, I think, the leader of the second Israel. I think he saw them as very important. And when he came to power, one of the things that he put for himself was to, first of all, to, I would say, to eliminate the gaps between the first and second Israel. And by doing that, he did the most, I would say, the biggest social project in the history of Israel, which is Project Renewal, of taking those poverty neighborhoods, the development towns, and he put there billions of shekels. By the way, Begin decided to change the lira into shekel. Until Begin came to power, we had the Israeli lira, and the lira is like a pound, and it was a legacy from the British government here. And one of his decisions was that we are going to change our currency, and we called it a shekel, like we had in the times of the Maccabees, in the first, second temple, the Israeli shekel. So this is also only a small story. And actually he saw, first of all, the second Israel, and not only, you know, really he put a lot of the budget of those times in the Project Renewal, was taking neighborhoods, adding rooms for those small apartments. I met once one of our conferences, a guy that was in one of those who was born and was lived in one of those small apartments, and he said that he used to sleep on the refrigerator. He had like a lying refrigerator, and he slept there because they didn't have enough room. And when Begin in this Project Renewal added other rooms to the apartments and make them bigger, so they have place to make their homework and so on, and it was very important. And it was also a very big, there was a big social aspects. There were a lot of courses to develop skills against drug addicts and so on, against addiction to drugs and so on. And this was one of the biggest projects. Also, until Begin came to power, going to high school, to the three last, I would say, classes of Yud Aleph, Bet, like when you are 16 until 18.
Right, the last grades.
The last grades, it cost money. And Begin, one of the first moves was to say that everybody who wants to learn should learn, and we should not take money for those last three grades. It was very important, especially in, I would say, making smaller the gaps between the first and second Israel. And I think also he put a lot of emphasis about symbolic action, symbolic act. One of his first symbolic act was in 78, when the president of Israel, that was Katzir, told him that he wants to finish his office and return back to the Weizmann Institute, where he was there a professor. And Begin said that he will vote only for a Mizrahi president, for a president who comes from what we call the second Israel, or from Jews from those countries. And we see Yitzhak Navon, who became a president, first time a president that wasn't born in Russia or Poland, but actually what we call the Mizrahi president. When he had to elect the chief of staff to the army, he elected Moshe Bachetzi, as we called it, Moshe Levi, as the chief of staff of the army. And the army was very important in how we see the core Israeli symbols. Because if you are a fighter in the army in the 70s, so you are considered to be one of the elites. And it was a very important speech by Dudu Topaz in one of the election rallies of the labor, which is very famous for almost every Israeli. And Dudu Topaz says there, in the main rally of the labor, he said that the voters of the Likud are not going to the army, and if they are going to the army and they are chachchachim, which is kind of, I would say, kind of an insult for Jews that were born in Arab countries.
Yeah, like riffraff, kind of.
Riffraff, yes.
Like lower class. Riffraff. Yeah.
Well, and they are not going to the army, and if they are going to the army, they are usually the people who are standing in the gate and open the gate and close it. This is what they are doing in the army. And I think that there, Begin understood the importance of how Israelis see their elite. And he said, okay, so I will take the chief of staff and I will make sure that from all the candidates, and he had other candidates that were equal or even better than Moshe Levi, than Moshe Bachetzi, as we call him, and he decided to name him and to make him the chief of staff of the army, a guy that was born in Iraq, whose parents used to work in the marketplace. They had a small, I would say, table in the market, and he decided to elect him and to choose him as the chief of staff of the army and not the other candidate. And so you can see a lot of symbolic action also to change the situation. And of course, we spoke about the economy. If you are thinking about it, we have 77 Begin, we have 79 Thatcher in Britain, we have 80 Reagan. And actually, I think there is a wave here. And the wave started here in Israel, in Jerusalem, of Begin, and then going to Thatcher, and then going to Reagan in the States. And I think that if we're looking for a stream or find something that binds them, all three of them together, is actually Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, the man who is, I would say, the high priest of the free market and so on, got the Nobel Prize for his ideas. You can see his fingerprints in all of those three cases. And when Begin wins the election, he brings Milton Friedman to Israel, and he went on television and he goes and meets with all of the leaders and all of the, I would say, the directors of the Ministry of Finance. And he is the man behind the big economic change in Israel, the big economic plan that Begin actually launches in the end of 77. And that when about, for instance, abolishing all kinds of taxes, like we had the taxes of, I would say, travel taxes, that you had to pay some taxes if you wanted to buy tickets and to go to a vacation. There was the taxes on the inheritance tax that was very important in Israel, and Begin abolished it. And privatizing a lot of banks that were owned by the government, like Bank Tfachot. It is a bank that gave mortgages, and it was owned by the government. And Begin said, with all due respect, the government should not take part in the free market, and in, I would say, enjoying where the capital should go. And there was another bank that owned by the government called Bank for Trade that used to give support for trade. And he also privatized this bank as well, and a lot of other, I would say, steps, but also consciously, until Begin came to power, you can see that in the newspaper and the discourse in Israel, if somebody is, let's say, invested in the stock exchange, it was considered like he's doing something bad. It's like he's not working, he's doing all kinds of, investing in the stock exchange. It was like, you had to do it and not tell all your friends that you are investing in the stock exchange. And you can see that until 77, labor is usually in the platforms and political platforms and so on. They are speaking only about socialism and so on. And after 77, you can see that they are starting to speak about, I would say, how they call it planned capitalism or a human capitalism and so on. So you can see that for the first time after those 4 years, even the labor is starting to take all the terms of the Likud, of the right. Right. This is also a very important change that Begin did in those years. I think it's also marks a turning point, as I said, in the whole world. I think there is a new generation, the first generation after the Second World War thought that the state should be intervening, more to intervene in the economy in order not to arrive to all kinds of regimes like Nazism, like fascism, and the state should be much more active and putting a lot of the budget in order to make sure that nobody will be starving and so on. And I think this generation of 77, this is the start of the new liberalism, the new economic liberalism that started in Israel. And for Milton Friedman, for instance, Israel was very important because he used to say that there is no people like the Jewish people who gained so much from the free market, and on the same way, there isn't any people like the Jewish people who did everything they can to destroy the free market. If we are speaking about Marx and we're speaking about a lot of the leaders of the Soviet Union. And for him, Israel was, I would say, really, like a laboratory for him. And he wrote a lot about this election, not just a political election, but election that shows that the Jewish people decided to be true to its real identity of the real tradition of free market and free enterprise, and not giving up for those 30 years of planned economy, of socialism, and so on. So this was also very important.
Okay, that's great. There's a huge amount. I know there's a lot more you could say about this, but I want to let's press on. And I'm going to go to questions from the audience in just a minute. Just one last question from me before I do that, which is that one of the things I think that maybe people are less aware of or just haven't thought about is that when Begin came to power, the institutions of the state had been run by basically the same people, or the same people, and then their disciples, Ben Gurion, and then the people that came after Ben Gurion, Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres, for 30 years or more, as you said. And so he came to power at the head of a state apparatus, which was in many ways hostile to some of the ideas that he was implementing. And it's not like the United States, where a new administration comes in and then all the staff of all the sort of senior staff in government departments are replaced by the president's appointees. It's much more like the British system, and I think probably many other parliamentary democracies, where you have a civil service that stays in place regardless of who is of which party is in power. But because the same party has been in power for such a long time, that civil service, those government workers, were conditioned to a certain way of thinking. And Begin encountered a lot of obstacles, right, when he came to power. Would that be fair to say, because of this sort of pre-existing, more socialist-leaning state system?
Right. That's a very important point. What you said, the state apparatus was very identified with the party, with Labour Party.
Right.
And you know that for many, many years, you needed to be a member of the working union with the red. They had this red card that you show in order to get work in the state apparatus. I can tell you about my family. My parents came My father came on the last ship of the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the underground, called Ben Hecht, in 47. And although they weren't so revisionist, but this is the ship that they found in order to arrive to Eretz Israel. They were caught by the British, were sent to Cyprus. My father had his bar mitzvah behind bars and in this camp in Cyprus. And when they came in 48, when the state was established and they were let in, so when they got and they say, which ship you are from? They say, Ben Hecht. They say, oh, we're sorry, we don't have any apartments for you. Oh, we're sorry, yeah, you can't have any work in the state apparatus. So this was the reality. I worked in the Begin Center, as you said, and there was a woman who was taking part in the King David attack by the Irgun. It was the headquarters of the British Mandatory. And she was the woman who called them and said, we have a bomb in the basement, please leave the hotel. And in the 70s, Begin brought her because there was a book by the British saying, well, we didn't got any notice and so on. And he brought her to a press conference and she said, I gave the order, I called them and I told them and this, that. And she worked in the Jewish agency and she was fired the next day. And then Begin brought her back. She asked Golda Meir to bring her back. She was brought back, but her career was stopped there. And when I was in the Begin Center, I think it was 96, I tried to brought her to speak in a conference. And she said, I will come as an audience, but I'm afraid to speak because I am in an elderly home that is owned by the working union called Mishan. And I'm afraid that they will throw me out when they will find out that 60 years ago I was in the Etzel. And so there wasn't, and we had this oral history project and we brought a lot of people from the Etzel in the 2000. I mean, like it was 50, 60 years later. And when they saw the camera, they say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't speak because I have a son that is working in the electricity company. And the electricity company is known to be leading by the working union and so on. So you understand how much the state apparatus was really a part of the party. And a lot of Begin's reform were stopped by this apparatus, and especially by the working union, because when Begin came to power, the working union was in charge for almost 50% of the market, factories owned by the working union. For instance, from banks to the post office and so on. And there were a lot of reforms that Begin wanted to do. And he knew that if he would do them, there will be a strike that will actually cripple the whole Israeli economy. And a lot of them stopped. And only in 1985, when there was the unity government and the situation was so bad, that Shimon Peres, as the prime minister, could actually, as the leader of the labor, could actually say to the working union leader, who was part of his party and was under, and he was under the authority of Shimon Peres, he could tell them, you have to do that, and we cannot resist, and so on. So, and Begin was at home, seeing that a lot of his reform was actually was put in place in 1985. So yes, like you said, it was a big problem.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So let's go to some questions. Eric Passman asked, and this relates to your point about Begin making Israel more of a Jewish state or making the Jewish element stronger. Did Begin open his house on Shabbat to allow the public to visit?
So yes, Begin opened on Motzei Shabbat. His house was opened, and a lot of his supporters from Kerem HaTemanim and Shkunat HaTikva, who were a lot of what we call the second Israel, as I said before, that were much more tradition and so on, used to come to his house in Rosenbaum Street in Tel Aviv, his small apartment. It was like a one-bedroom apartment that they lived there, the whole family. And they came and they make Havdalah and they were singing all the songs of the underground and so on. And yes, a lot of people used to come on Motzei Shabbat to his house. And Begin really opened his house for everybody.
Great. Jonathan Lieberman talks about, he mentions that in May 1977, he was a 17-year-old on a program at Kibbutz Be'erot Yitzchak, which was part of it, which was a Kibbutz Dati, a religious kibbutz. And he says that he recalled the horror of the realization that Labour had lost. And the horror was, he said he remembers writing to his parents in the UK, the horror was that there was a real fear in the country that this man who had craved power for 30 years was coming to power and what he might do with that power. There was a real fear that he would be, the sort of, I guess, like the apocalyptic scenario that you talked about. And he asks if you can expand on the feelings of division in the country after the election.
So yes, there was a great feeling of, as you said, of diversion. And for instance, in the Knesset, the opposition is using to sit on one side and the coalition on the other side. And when Begin formed his government, they had to change seats. They had to move from their seats to the other, and Labour didn't want to. They said, "What? We are 30 years sitting in this side of the parliament." And it was actually a small crisis, and they couldn't, form the government and to do the inauguration and so on, because Labour said, "But we are sitting here like for 30 years, perhaps we won't move," and so on. And actually, if you can see the reaction in the newspapers of the leaders, there is Yitzhak Ben Aaron who said that the people had mistaken and so on, and there was really a great fear from what we call the unknown, and you can see it in the articles and and the reaction also by journalists and abroad. The Likud actually, as I said, had to publish an ad in the newspaper saying, "Don't worry, everything will be fine," which is, it sounds today like something that you cannot bear, but yes, you have to see that Begin was considered by a lot, Ben-Gurion, for instance, didn't call him in the early years, didn't want to call him by his name. He said the man who is sitting to the right of Dr. Bader, which was like his second in command in the party. And later, Ben-Gurion said that Begin he wrote a very famous letter calling him a Hitleristic character and so on. So Begin was really considered as a demon by a lot of parts of the Israeli left. It's not like a leader that is replacing another leader, but he was like a demon entering to the minister office.
Sheldon Lerman relates to that point. He asks about Begin's relationship with Ben-Gurion in the unity government in 1967. I assume you mean Sheldon, because obviously Ben-Gurion wasn't in that government. It was the government of Levi Eshkol. But Begin did, I think, request or suggest that Ben-Gurion return to power, I think, in 1967.
Because in 1967, I think Begin, like a lot of people, didn't thought that Levi Eshkol is the right figure to lead the government in a time of such a military crisis. We thought that the state is on the brink of destruction. So many armies around us are preparing to attack, and he really fought for the people. This shows how Begin was willing to take his biggest adversary, bring him back, although he was, in a party, in a opposition party to Mapai. He was really established Rafi and so on. And this shows only about Begin, how great he was. Although what Ben-Gurion said about him and so on. Yes, there was, I would say, they didn't have the good relations, but in the end, Begin and Ben-Gurion came to terms, and Ben-Gurion even wrote a letter to Begin saying that he's sorry about some of the things that he said about him, and that his wife always said, like Paula Ben Gurion, that the wife of Ben Gurion always said, Ben Gurion said, my wife always thought that you are a very nice guy. So, so there was this, but Begin didn't forgot Altalena, he didn't forget how Ben Gurion gave the order to shoot the ship and causing about, I think, 16 of his fighter to actually being killed in Altalena. And he never forgot it to Ben Gurion, didn't also, I would say, forgave him also, didn't forgive him also for that.
Okay. David Sassoon asks about Begin's involvement in the bringing of Ethiopian Jews to Israel.
This is also a very important point. The first thing that Begin did when he came to power as prime minister, you know, he called the head of the Mossad. His name was there General Hofi, and the head of the Mossad gave him a brief about all the situation and the crises and so on. And in the end, Begin asked him two questions. He asked him, what are we doing still in finding Nazi war criminals and bringing them back and bringing them to court? And the second thing he says, I want you to bring my brothers of Ethiopia to Israel. And this is actually how we started the whole process of bringing Ethiopian Jews to Israel. This is actually because of Begin and his decision there. And some of them arrived during his term in office, and most of them arrived later in the terms of Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres.
Jonathan Forstott asks about the personal affection that Mizrahi Jews had for, as he says, this most Ashkenazi Jew. Can you explain it? Can you say more about how that came about? Because obviously Begin was this kind of quintessential European Jew in so many ways, and yet he was the man who brought the Mizrahim into sort of political life.
Right. And, you know, I remember once I had a conversation with Shalom Kital, who was a journalist, and then he was a young journalist. Today he's not so young, but he told me that he was outside the door of Begin when he was prime minister, and when they got the notice that Jimmy Carter is coming to Israel. He came in the end of the 78, or beginning of 79, to mediate and to close the peace agreement. And Jimmy Carter came to Jerusalem, Cairo, in order to close all the details. And Begin called his wife and said, Aliza, the Carters are coming. You should prepare the gefilte fish. So perhaps this is why Carter was so against us after the meal that he had, but so you can see how Polish he was, Menachem. And when you see this way that the Mizrahi saw him actually as a kind of a Mizrahi Jews, a lot of Mizrahi said, no, Begin is actually from Morocco, he's not from Poland, he's a Moroccan Jews. And I once read an article by Toni Morrison, the Afro-American author of the books there, and she said that Bill Clinton was the first Afro-American president because he plays the saxophone and he's coming from a very poor family and his brother has some drugs and so on. And I think that Begin was perhaps the first Mizrahi prime minister because, first of all, he was very traditional and he spoke Judaism. He didn't spoke like Ben Gurion and Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir, who were very secular. And so, he wore the black yarmulke when he quoted a lot. Yeah. So from the Bible. And he went to, do the shul on Shabbat. And you can see how he also treated them. He didn't try to patronize them. And when he came, for instance, to all of those neighborhoods that he spoke, usually it came with the suit and not like Ben Gurion with the short trousers and the khaki and, and those things. And I think they felt that he is also part of them because, I think that Begin liked the traditional, like the what we call the Second Israel, were much more, was not affected by all of those winds of secularism, of modernism, and he was very much grounded in the life of the diaspora. And he was a very, diaspora Jew that you can see. And he didn't, like, for instance, change his name or Hebraize his name because he thought, yes, there is an importance. And he saw what happens in Israel as another chain in the big, I would say, necklace of the Jewish life, and not like tearing this necklace and we are starting from zero. And I think they identified it with him. And even, it started in the underground, because if you are taking the Olei Gardon, the people who went to the gallows, from the Etzel, you can see there Feinstein and Barazani, you can see there El-Kachi and Weiss and Nakar and so on. So you can see how many Orel Jews that comes from what we call the Second Israel joined the Irgun. And since then they started, I would say, this romance between Begin and Second Israel from that time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It makes me think when you, again, to go back to the sort of broader theme that we started with of how much Israel of today is the Israel that Begin created. And one of the big changes, I guess, of Israel today is that there's not that binary secular religious divide that there used to be, in the sense that, it used to be like, that in the Ashkenazi community, at least, if you weren't religious, if you weren't part of the Dati community or Haredi, then you were very secular, and religion played no role in your life. And the Mizrahim were the ones who, whether or not they were strictly religious, nevertheless had this reverence for tradition, and they might go to the football match after going to shul in the morning or whatever, but it was still that they went to shul, and they had a Shabbat meal, and Begin was unusual in a way in that he was Ashkenazi, and he was in that traditional mindset. And today, I think today's Israel is much more like Begin. It's much more like, Shmuel Rosner has that great book about it, about how in today's Israel, the vast majority of Israelis, even if they don't define themselves as religious, have a sort of appreciation for elements of Jewish tradition, which wasn't the case 30, 40 years ago. And I think that's also testament to the changes that Begin created.
Right. I think it is.
Okay, so let's go back to some more questions. This is a little outside of the time scale of your book, which is his first term, but maybe you could lend us your expertise on this. Sviberg asked about the reasons behind Begin's decision to step down from office, to resign.
Well, I think, I was very surprised to see that Begin used to say from like when he was 50 already, that when he will be 70, he's going to resign and to withdraw to his house and so on. So a lot of years before, he said, when I will be 70, I will leave office and I will let somebody else to take this spot. But I think what happened to him with his wife when he went to the States, and the doctors, his wife was in the hospital, and the doctors told him, don't worry, she's not in a crucial situation, and you can go and return, and everything is under control. Mm. And he was in the States, she actually died, and he wasn't with her. And Aliza Begin was his, I would say, his comfort, and she was his power also. When he went to Camp David, so he insisted that his wife will be with him. And, there wasn't, Rosalind Carter wasn't there, and Jihan Saadat wasn't there, but Aliza Begin was there. And every time that he came back to the cabin in Camp David, she was waiting for him. And, she was also very strong. She was also in Beitar in Poland. He met her there, and she was a very strong-minded woman and very to the right wing and supported the land of Israel and so on. And I think when she was his comfort for a lot of time, also in the underground and so on. Mm. And for him, it really broke him when he wasn't with her, when she passed away. And when he had to face also the Lebanon war with all of the casualties, the numbers were, there was this protest just in front of his house, with the numbers changing all the time, and he didn't have a leader with him to support him, I think this is actually really broke him down, and he decided he can't continue like that anymore.
Okay, just a final question, I think. So one of the ways in which Begin is maybe misunderstood, or one of the things that people are surprised about when they learn about Begin, because they have certain preconceptions about what right wing means and what left wing means, or they just do a sort of cut and paste from their own country and think what right and left mean in their own country. And the surprising thing they find is that Begin was far more liberal in all kinds of ways than the Israeli left. So he opposed the military administration of Israeli Arabs, for example, from 48 to 66, 65. He spoke very much in favor of free speech at time when Ben Gurion was trying to shut down dissent, that kind of thing. How did that sort of play into his prime ministership when he became prime minister? Were there elements of that sort of were there things that changed in the way the country was run, sort of towards that sort of liberal angle?
Well, I want to say, you said a very important thing about how against he was about the military administration on the Arabs until 66. Begin, although he was on the right and he didn't got any votes or any people to vote for him because of his insistence, but he insisted, and he was the main voice against the military administrative about Israeli Arabs, because he said, I'm sorry, if they are our citizens, we shouldn't put them on this military administrative. And when he came to power, if you're thinking about it, he came to power in 77. There were three different, I would say, Arab population under military administrative. We had the Druze in the Golan Heights, we had the Bedouin in the Sinai Peninsula, and we had the Arabs in Judea and Samaria. So what Begin did is, first of all, one of his most important, I think, achievement, that he annexed the Golan Heights in the Knesset. He passed the law that making sure that the Golan Heights is a part of the land of Israel, and actually annexed that. And by that, actually the Druze in the Golan Heights, the Arab Druze, got the Israeli identification card, and they became citizens. And he finished the military administration in the Golan. The Bedouin in the peninsula, he gave back to Saadat, to Egypt, and they got back their citizenship as the Arabs. And for the Arabs in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, he offered an autonomy of self-rule, in order also because he thought about how we can still have those Judea and Samaria, Gaza, he saw as a part of the land of Israel, and should be the part of the state of Israel forever, but how we are coming toward the Arabs there. And he offered an autonomy, which is, I would say also, it was the first time that a leader that really spoke about them like that and offered an alternative. So yes, you can see that also, and also the supremacy of law. Menachem Begin was really one of the great advocacy of the supremacy of law, because he said that in Israel, we don't have really difference between the parliament, the Knesset, and the government. The government, if it had the majority in the Knesset, it became a government. So actually the government and parliament are the same. And that's why he thought that there should be a supremacy of the judiciary over the parliament and the government. So, and he, he did also try to name an Arab judge in the Supreme Court. We have letters that I saw that he approached the leader of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice, and and so on. So you can see that he saw himself as a national liberal. He was very national. He thought about strengthening the Jewish identity. He saw the land of Israel as a whole and only of the Jewish people and so on. And on the other side, yes, there was also the liberal aspects. I think that he got from Jabotinsky, Zev Jabotinsky, his mentor, his leader and so on, was also speaking about an Arab prime minister, an Arab president and so on. And on the other side, saw the two parts of the Jordan as a part of Israel and so on.
Fantastic. Okay. Moshe Fuchsman-Shal, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening and for explaining so much to us about the man who for whom this center is named, where I'm sitting now. I asked you at the beginning, actually, before everyone arrived, I asked if the book is going to be available in English, and you said not just yet, so maybe in the future. So I hope, for the sake of those on this call that aren't going to be able to read it in Hebrew, that we do see it in English.
So this is the book, actually, as we said, the Ma'apach, and I'm not objective, but I think it's a very good book.
It's got rave reviews, so it's not just you saying it. We did actually have a question about how someone in New York could get a copy of it.
Well, if you write on the internet, Ma'apach, my name, I'm sure that there is a lot of websites that they can send it.
Okay, so if not, and I'm writing my email address in the chat, because if people have more questions about the book or about this, they can email me. And also, if people want to be on my mailing list to hear more about these events, they should email me to get on the mailing list. Next week, we're continuing this series about Menachem Begin. We have former Justice Minister and Finance Minister Dan Meridor, who's also former Cabinet Secretary to Menachem Begin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thanks again to Moshe Fuchsman-Shal for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Farewell, everyone.